in a great tumble trying to get the kids out.
He was German reasonably well.
German
And Hebrew. German and
What
Hebrew.
about Finland through? Ich sehe da Sachen neue und noch hoch als alle verstehen Jiddisch. Das seien unsere Programme, das einzige Programm, hat ein hohen kulturellen Niveau, welche geben jeden heute, jeden ersten Sonntag, jeden heute geben wir da ein Programm in Jiddisch. Und wer schließt sich an unser jiddischen Club, wir bekommen ständig Meldungen und sie zahlen bloß $1. Für Nichtmitglieder kostet $3. Der Komiker jüdischer Winkel, wir sind da, wir wollen haben ein Purenball. Es wird spielen die jüdische Kaffee-Klezmer-Gruppe, wir wollen da tanzen und zubeißen, wir wollen sich machen fröhlich. Dan laat mich alle hinein.
Wer moet das vorkommen?
Dem 7. März, de erste Sonntag von März. Teuer Freund. Wir sind heute Edes von einer Wiederaufladung von Jiddisch und von der jiddischen Kultur. Nach dem größten Gruppen, denn wir haben verloren Millionen Jiddisch redende Menschen und zwischen sie sind Verfahren gegangen, sind umgekommen durch zukünftige jiddische Schreiber und Dichter und Künstler, haben mir gemeint, als mehr wird Jiddisch nicht existieren. Nur wir haben gehabt, Autors. Letztens sehen wir eine Gruppe von jungen, talentierten Menschen in Israel, in England, in Frankreich, in Andernus und auch sicher in Amerika. Man lernt Jiddisch in den Colleges und Universitäten. Und eine von den talentierten jüdischen Schreiber, Poeten ist Catherine Hallerstein. Ich will zugeben, als nicht nur Dr. Hermann und Mary Hallerstein seien gebencht, hoffentlich als Tochter, noch wir alle seien gebencht. Es ist sehr angenehm zu sein, ein junger Pony, der lebt auf die alte jüdische Kultur. Und wie man sagt bei uns, in der Welt, door le door, generation to generation. Und es ist natürlich, als einer von unseren älteren, bewussten Jiddischisten wird vorstellen, wir kommen durch Jiddischisten. Ich will für euch vorstellen, euch allen gut bekannten Jiddischist, David Guralnik.
Guten Abend, euch allen. Es ist für mich besonders groß Vergnügen vorzustellen, unser heutige Rednerin. Noch macht man es seinen, dort zwischen uns heint bei Nacht etliche, was verstehen wenig Jiddisch, welche vorstellen auf Englisch. Das ist mein Beutel. Dr. Catherine Hellerstein is well known to most of us here this evening, having graced us with her presence and her erudition on previous occasions. She is currently Assistant Professor of Yiddish Language and Literature at the University of Pennsylvania, educated at Wellesley and Brandeis University with a PhD in English and American Lit from Stanford. She's not only a teacher, she's a poet, translator of Yiddish poetry, and an eminent scholar. She's taught at a number of colleges and universities, and as a matter of fact, just this past year, in 1992, She was on leave of absence as a visiting assistant professor of Jewish Studies and International Studies at the University of Washington in Seattle. She has a long and distinguished list of publications. I'm not going to go into all of them, but I also want to point out that she has received a number of research fellowships, including one from the National Endowment for the Humanities. She also won the Marie Serkin Fellowship, which enabled her to complete her book, Selected Poems of Katya Maladovsky, which is currently under consideration by a publisher. Her poems and articles have appeared in many journals and anthologies, as well as in the New York Times, New York Review of Books. Kathy, Kolzman Mildutzen zich heen had mag ik deelroepen bij welke noemen, ja?
Over Catherine. Over Catherine.
Catherine is married to David Stern, an associate professor of rabbinic and medieval Hebrew literature, also at the University of Pennsylvania. And they have two adorable children, Rebecca and Jonah. And of course, of special interest to us is the fact that her parents, Drs. Mary and Herman Hellerstein, are longtime members and very strong supporters of our Yiddish Cultural Committee and of the Workmen's Circle. This March, Kathy is going to be appearing at a conference on women in Yiddish literature that will take place at Mount Holyoke College, and she will be one of the workshop leaders. As you know, this is a major interest of hers. And also, one of her articles will be appearing in the Pakenträger. Those of you, and I hope it's most of you, who are supporters of the Yiddish Book Center in Massachusetts, who received the publication, the Pakenträger, are familiar with it and know that it's one of the miracles of the late 20th century. There will be an article by Catherine in the forthcoming issue, which I think comes out in about a week or so. This evening, Dr. Hellerstein will speak to us on Yiddishkeit, a legacy of language in translation and poems. It gives me a great deal of pleasure, very personal pleasure, to present to you Dr. Catherine Hellerstein.
Schönen Dank, herzlichen Dank, David. Und es ist für mich ein Vergnügen zu sein da in Cleveland, in dem jüdischen Winkel, bei meiner Tate Mama und mit allen meinen Chaverim und meinen Freunden. Und Herren? Ich kenne es, Herren, okay. Noch einmal, ein bisschen mehr, okay? Besser? Okay, darf gehen auf einen Fuß, ein bisschen, okay. Was ich habe gesagt, ist, ich danke alle meine Freunde und meine Chaverim, die seien da heint, und ich danke mit meinem Herz mein Tate, Mama, Drs. Mary und Herman Hellerstein. Ich danke Dina Prigerson und Simon Swirsky and, of course, Take David Geralnik. Thank you very much to all of these people whose names even the non-Yiddish speakers, I think, can recognize in my American Yiddish accent. I thank all my friends and family in Cleveland, and I'm very, very happy to be here. weil ich hab geschrieben dem Referat erst auf Englisch mit etlicher Freudisch zurück und nachdem übergesetzt auf Yiddish, will ich reden heint in beide Loschens. Because I first wrote this talk several months ago in English and later translated it into Yiddish, or parts of it, I'm going to speak tonight in both languages. In fact, my theme this evening is the interrelationship between the two languages, Yiddish and English, in my own life. And so the bilingual history of this very lecture becomes an example of what I want to talk about. Yiddishkeit is a kishivdik wort. Yiddishkeit is a kishivdik wort auf Yiddish und auf Englisch. Was wird kleiner und wächst größer, gewinnt in was man will es soll bedeuten. Von einer Seite meint das Wort Yiddishkeit nur der das, die Religion von den Jiden. Von der anderen Seite beteiligt Yiddishkeit etwas, was man kennt. Die Atmosphäre von Sein a Yid, die kulturelle Identifizierung von einem Mensch durch Sachen und durch Ideen. Von Knedlich und Joich bis Lichtbändchen, bis Teure, bis Volksgeschichte, bis a Sprach und a Literatur. Yiddishkeit in Cleveland accent, in my accent, in English, is one of those wonderful words in both Yiddish and English that contracts and expands depending upon what you want it to mean. On the one hand, this Yiddish word says simply Judaism, the religion. On the other hand, Yiddishkeit can denote that amorphous entity, Jewishness, suggesting an ambiance, something that one recognizes, a person's cultural identification through things and concepts, from knedlech in chicken soup, to candle lighting on Shabbos, to ethics, to law, to history, to a language and its literature. I'm calling this talk Yiddishkeit because I found my way to approach and appropriate Jewishness and Judaism through the language and the poetry of Yiddish. In dem Wort Yiddishkeit finde ich ein Beispiel von mein Leben und mein Arbeit, weil das Wort geht hin und her zwischen Yiddish und Englisch, zwischen Sprachen und Überlebungen. In the very word itself, which travels back and forth between Yiddish and English, between languages and experiences, I find a paradigm for my life and my work. Ich bin ein Dichter auf Englisch. I write poems in English. Ich setz über Lieder von Yiddish. I translate poetry from Yiddish. Ich bin ein Forscher von jiddischer Poesie. I do scholarly research on Yiddish poetry. Und ich bin eine Lehrerin von jiddischer Sprache und Literatur. And I teach Yiddish language and literature at the college level. I find that all four of these activities feed into one another and complement one another, and this is what I hope my examples tonight will show you. Making poems is simply part of my nature. I've been writing poems since childhood, and this weekend, going through some old papers with my parents, I discovered a couple of my earliest samples, which I will mercifully spare you this evening. But I do have the written evidence that when I was 7 and 8, I was writing little poems, love poems to my parents, of English, in English though. I consciously decided, though, to start translating poetry when, as a doctoral student in English, I woke up to the dreadful thought that I would spend the next several years writing a dissertation entirely in academic prose. I rationalized, well, if I translate poetry, at least I'll be writing part of my dissertation in verse and will be spared the academies that can kill a poet. When Yiddish is euch gewen an Überkleid, and Yiddish too was a choice for me. I grew up, as you know, obviously in a Midwestern Reform Jewish home, right here in Cleveland Heights. The memory of my Yiddish-speaking grandparents from Brest-Litovsk, Celia and Samuel Hellerstein, who died when I was very young, remained vivid through the stories that my father told. but their language was just a rumor to me. My mother's parents, Nellie and Harold File, and their parents were American-born. My mother's great-grandparents had worked very hard to become American, Omaha style, which essentially required them to forget their Bohemian Yiddish in the 1860s, or if not to forget it, to make it run underground, like an underground stream. Our temple, which was a distinguished institution, which was and still is a distinguished institution, taught Hebrew and stressed ethics rather than ethnics in the 1950s and the 60s when I was a student there. Although today I think that that it's going maybe in the other direction a little bit. Und die Kinderjahren seien gewähnt reich mit a mishpochetiker Jiddischkeit, a Jiddischkeit mit Herz. Aber meine formale Bildung ist gewähnt heute Amerikan. My childhood was rich in Jewish family feeling and in Yiddishkeit through the family, but my education was mainstream American. I decided to study Yiddish in a flash during a graduate student epiphany. Auf Yiddish, das heißt, Epiphany, das heißt, in a Revelatia, an Antpleckung, a Hisgalis. One summer afternoon, sitting in the office of my revered professor, a famous British poet who loved the American language because it was so folksy and quaint to him with his Oxford accent. But I became infuriated that hot afternoon with the anti-Semitic jibes of Ezra Pound, the great modernist the great modernist American poet. That was not a Freudian slip, that was a Yiddish slip. Aber was gewesen ein größer Dichter auf Englisch, ein amerikanischer Dichter, aber es gewesen euch ein Antisemit, a Soine Yisrael. So I took his advice, Ezra Pound's advice to the young poet. Sein Eitzes zum jungen Dichter. See, I have great pleasure in talking about Ezra Pound in Yiddish because I feel like it's getting my revenge on him and or putting him into my own terms. And my professor was urging this advice on me. Pound said, translate to learn your tradition. Das heißt, verteidigt, zu lernen sich eier Tradition, eier Jerusha. In KAS habe ich angeheuben sich lernen Yiddish und übersetzen jiddische Dichter. So in rebellious conformity, I decided right then and there to study Yiddish and to translate Yiddish poetry. May Ezra Pound rest in peace and know that he stimulated such a project. Translating has given me the privilege of becoming intimate with several Yiddish poets. And each of these poets that I'm going to talk about today has a personal connection either to me or I feel it's a personal connection through their connections to Cleveland. And it's a pleasure to have the daughter of the Drost family, Elaine Friedman, in the back. I don't mean to embarrass you, but I'm thrilled that you're here because her parents were very close friends, as you will hear, of two of the poets that I'm going to talk about. And I think, and because I've become intimate through translation with these three poets that I'm going to talk about tonight, I think there's no better way for one poet to read another than to translate. Because when you translate, you really have to confront every single word, every single line, every single rhyme, every single choice of consonants and assonants in the poetry. And then you have to try to say it back again to the original poet in your own way. Translating these poets, I became a ventriloquist, sometimes a responding echo, sometimes even a cannibal, at other times a curious granddaughter rummaging through a treasure chest of my would-be grandparents, my Yiddish poet grandparents, trying on other voices for size, other voices that sound distinctly of their own moment in life, their own moment in language and history, and yet at moments, sometimes they ring even truer than my own voice for me. So this evening I'd like to tell you about three of these poets. To some of you this will be an introduction, to others of you, to many of you, you know the poets and their poems, but this will be a reacquaintance perhaps. And I would like to read you a few of the poems that I have worked on of theirs that have brought me into Yiddishkeit and from which has grown out my own version of Yiddishkeit. The first of these poets is Moshe Leib Halpern. You might know he was born in 1886 in Zlotchev, the little shtetl in Galicia, and he died in New York in 1932. Moshe Leib Halpern. And I've given you a handout that has the first poetic selection is two poems by Halpern, and I'm going to read them to you, but why don't you let me tell you a little bit about him before we flip the pages. I'll give you time to get there. Ist gewesen einer von die wichtigsten moderne jüdische Dichters. Einer von die junge, eine Gruppe von Schreibers, was haben geschrieben von 1908 bis die 20er Jahre. One of the foremost Yiddish poets, the foremost modern Yiddish poets, Halpern was involved with Die Junge, the young upstarts, the young Turks, a group of rebellious young poets who in the 19-teens and the 1920s tried to define a new modern poetry in Yiddish, and it was very much a modern American poetry in Yiddish. Halpern was at war with himself. His poems are romantic and also devastatingly ironic. Ist gewesen ein Spieler mit allen Traditions. He played with and against all traditions. First, he broke down the cliches of Yiddish protest poetry, the cliches that the labor poets like Morris Rosenfeld and David Edelstadt had established, the great poems of workers uniting and rebelling against the difficult conditions under which they worked. And then, but Halpern wasn't just content with parodying, with making new and rewriting and reformulating the conventions of the poetry of the labor poets. He then turned and parodied the cliches and the conventions of his own contemporaries, of his friends in Die Junge. So he was a very wild and crazy guy. He was always even undermining and mocking his own poems and the things that he said himself. And last spring, I was very, very privileged to meet his son, Ying Halpern, when I was teaching at the University of Washington. And I was able to view an enormous collection of Halpern's extraordinary artwork and his paintings. He was also a wonderful, unknown painter and graphic artist. And as I said before, Halpern had Cleveland connections. The Drost family helped sponsor his second book of poems, Die Goldene Pave, The Golden Peacock, in 1929. And if you look at the original edition, it says published in Cleveland by the Cleveland Yiddish Group, the Cleveland Yiddish League in 1929. And this happens to be the poet I wrote my dissertation on, and I've published a book of translations of his poems. Now, in all of his iconoclasm, Halpern didn't write too much about Jewishness per se. He grew up in a pretty maskilic or enlightened home. He left home early at the age of 12 and went to Vienna, studied art there, and wasn't a traditional yeshiva bacher in any way. In fact, I think his Jewish education stopped in Cheder, if it got very far there. When biblical themes and biblical figures appear in his poems, they are reduced, ironized, and manipulated for the poet's own purposes. He was much more interested in Yiddish folk traditions rather than in Jewish religious themes, the standard Jewish things. And he showed this interest in folk traditions by writing folk-like poems. He wrote a lot of ballads. In his second book, Die Goldene Pave, if you look down the table of contents, it's Ballade von mein Wieglied, Ballade von Avram der Ketzev, and the ballad of my lullaby, the ballad of Abraham the butcher, the ballad of the king, the ballad of the penny, and so on and so forth. And in these poems, in these ballads, Halpern took the folk forms of ballad and lullaby. Of course, lullabies and ballads were mostly composed, true folk songs were composed by the famous author Anonymous, Anonymous was probably at least half female, if not more than half female. And he reappropriates these forms and tests them. His poems push the forms to their limits. He says, look at this poem. It looks like a folk poem. It looks like a folk song. It's not. It's a modern poem, but I'm deliberately making folk material into something modern. So he was trying to, in a way, as he was trying to break away from traditional Judaism, he was also making a connection and a bridge. But I'm not going to read you one of these poems tonight. They're very long and very subtle, very hard, I think, to get on first hearing. What first drew me to Halpern, though, was not his Yiddishkeit per se, and not even his Yiddish, his appropriation of Yiddish folklore, but the dilemmas of the new Yiddish-speaking immigrant in America. And the two poems that you have in front of you are from the book of his first book of poems in New York, and I've translated these two poems, and they both delineate the problems of the new immigrant in this country. Now watch your step. If you look at the first poem at the top of the page, and you look at the left-hand side of the page, even if you don't read Yiddish, you will notice that you can read the title, right? Because it's written in English. And this is how it appears in the first edition of the Yiddish book that Halpern wrote as well. Now, why would he have an English title on a Yiddish poem? Well, where have you seen this sign, watch your step? Anybody written? And a subway in New York City. Okay, so for Halpern, the archetypal immigrant experience, the thing that he had to get used to most initially, that sort of hit him in the face, was the subway system, the underground. He has a lot of poems about the underground trains in New York, and the sign, this ubiquitous warning, watch your step, becomes a kind of watchword for a Yiddish poem as well. So I'm going to read you the poem in Yiddish first and then in English. And you'll hear, as you listen to the Yiddish, even if you don't understand it, which most of you probably do, but you'll hear the sort of pounding rhythm and the relentless rhymes, which I tried probably not completely successfully, but I tried to imitate in English. And for me, I had to really watch my step, literally watch my feet, my metrical feet, as I tried to bring the poem from Yiddish into English. So watch your step. Gold ist die Zeit in dem goldenen Land. Geht men a Klung und a Häub mit der Hand, klappt sich Tieren zu hilfig und schnell, flieht der Express durch den schwarzen Tunnel, schneller von Wind und geschwinder von Blick, fliehen vorbei mit der Wand auf zurück, Sterne noch Sterne in Grün und in Rot. Grün ist das Leben und Rot ist der Tod. Los das Signal sich vor uns in Gejäg, warft und schleudert als auf unseren Weg. Ruderen Räder in wilden Geläuf, tragen sich Bahnen herab und herauf, tragen sich Vögel von Gold und von Blut, zittert sich mir ohne Begehr in mein Blut, heißer von Blut und noch heller von Gold. Hey, wie es wollt sich erhabt und gewollt, und da sah Vögel, ha, Sarah Pracht, jagt vorbei wie ein Blitz in der Nacht. Jagen und tragen sich Vögel und fliehen, lichtig wie Blitzen her und hin, lichtig wie Blitzen vorbei noch an, goldene Vögel von goldenem Land. Time is gold in the golden land, the ring of a bell and the wave of a hand, the doors snap shut, express trains fly through black tunnels quick as the eye, walls fly backward like a screen with stars after stars in red and in green. Life is green and death is red. Once a signal is sent out ahead, it hurtles everything out of its way. Wheels whirl in a wild melee. Trains swing up, swing down, swing fast. Birds of gold and greed zip past. And a desire fires up my blood, hotter than greed and brighter than gold. Oh, if I could only grab in my hand such a bird, how magnificent. Like lightning flashing in the night, birds race and dart and soar in flight. Brilliant as lightning, flash and descend, golden birds in the golden land. Well, the poem ends with an off rhyme, descend and land, so everything's sort of in a minor key when you translate from one language to another, but it's a, yes?
Could you share, there are some people who don't have any copies and we don't have any more.
Okay, sure, no problem. I'm sorry, I thought we made enough, but
If you need one, you have some. We have plenty.
So, as perhaps you could hear, if you couldn't actually, if you had to rely on the reading and didn't have the text to look at as well, you could hear in the poem how watch your step becomes a warning about the American way of life, the American values in life, the ever elusive and elusive temptations and desires, especially connected to material desires that the immigrant had to come across. Yes?
Will it be too difficult for you to speak up a little? My friend, or turn that up.
Well, I'm doing my best. Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me move this even closer now. Now I just hope it doesn't start squeaking. Is this better? Yes? Okay. I'm very sorry if thank you. No, thank you for telling me. Okay. The other poem on your page, at the bottom of the page, is called Ben Gaheim, Homesick. And at the time that Halpern wrote this poem, he would the immigrant. Oh, it did suddenly get turned up. Now I'm overwhelming you. Okay, is that no? Okay, is that okay? Can you all hear? Okay. Ben Gaheim. Morris Rosenfeld and other of the labor poets that were Halpern's predecessors often wrote very sentimental poems about homesickness, about longing for home, about nostalgia for the idealized old country. In these nostalgic poems, the shtetl streets were never muddy. There was always enough to eat, even if it wasn't really enough to eat, but somehow magically the tradition provided food and shelter and warmth. And the idealized homesickness poem was a kind of comfort to the immigrant who was in the cold, cruel world of America, the strangeness of America, in der Fremd, away from home, in the foreignness. And Halpern, though, of course, had to put a twist on this nostalgia, and his poem that looks like it's going to be a nostalgic poem about homesickness, he turns the idea of homesickness inside out. And listen to it. First I'll read it in English and then I'll read it in Yiddish. Homesick. Long for home and hate your homeland. Be a branch broken from a withered tree. Be a fleck of ash in a burning tower. Torment yourself with your pain, little man. If a lion strayed here, he would go mad. He would tear himself apart. Cry for your years, little man. Your tears fall into the sea like rain. Denke heim, wenn hast dein Heimland. Sei ein abgebrochen Zweigel von a Bäum a lang verdarfen. Sei a kleinschig Aschenteufel in a brennendicken Turm. Kass sich Menschel in dein Wettig. Wenn Leib soll da verblonden, wollte wahnsinnig geworden, wollte sich allein zerrissen. Wein auf deine Jorgen, Menschen, wie in Jam rein erregen, fallen deine Tränen. So this is hardly a nostalgic poem. It's about the bitter dilemma of being caught between two worlds. And in this kind of situation, I found, as I was learning to translate Yiddish, I also was in a way between two worlds, between English and Yiddish. Although English was my homeland and Yiddish was the new territory for me. And as a poet, I was working my way out of nostalgia for English and trying to find some kind of middle ground, which I don't think was as bitter as the actual homesickness of the immigrant. But somehow I found an analogy there. The second poet I'd like to talk to you about is a woman named Malka Chayfetz-Tuzman. Malka Chayfetz-Tuzman was born in 1893 and she died in 1987. Sie ist geboren in Kleindorf in Ukraine in a Hasidic Mishpacha. She was born in a small village in the Ukraine in a Hasidic family. And she came to Chicago in 1912 as a young girl and moved to the big city where she had some family, I think an older brother, settled. And her grandparents and her parents were both very unusual for Jews in the Ukraine, in the old country at all, because they had leased and run a farm for several generations. So she really had a farm girl's upbringing. They hired peasants to do the heavy work, or some of the heavy work, but she really grew up on a farm close to the land, very aware of the natural cycles. And this knowledge, this primal knowledge as a child, influenced and ran through her poetry for all her life. She married very young. She lived in Chicago. She and her husband, who was a cantor, Hazen, had 2 sons, and she made her living by teaching in the Yiddish schools. Later in her life, she lived in Milwaukee and other places in the Midwest, and then in Los Angeles for her late middle years. At the end of her life, she moved to Berkeley, and that's where she ended her life. And one of the members of the Cleveland Yiddish Winkel was Mrs. Sonia Tepper was Malka's student in Milwaukee when Sonia was a young girl. And so I feel not only that I worked with Malka, well, I didn't get to this part yet. I worked very closely with Malka when I was in graduate school. I was lucky enough to meet her, and she heralded me through. She was my guide, like Virgil was Dante's guide through heaven and purgatory and hell. Well, Malka was my guide through the paradise of Yiddish poetry when I was a graduate student. And so I knew her very well, and this is my other connection to her. But translating her poetry was even a more intimate and close connection. Malka published many poems from the 19-teens, 1914, 1919, and she published in the New York journals and the Chicago journals, and everywhere there was Yiddish and poetry, Malka's name was seen and heard. But she didn't actually manage to get a book out until 1949, when she was already in her late middle age. And in a way, she's typical of many women poets in Yiddish who had a hard time finding the funding and the organization to get their works published in a more permanent form, a less ephemeral form than a magazine. Her poems are characterized by eroticism, frankness, subversive devotion, wit, and they're written mostly in free verse. The first poem I'm going to read to you is called Lord My God. In fact, the 2 poems I want to read to you of Malka's are both devotional poems. And in these 2 poems, that means they're like prayers. They seem to be prayers. And in this sense, I think they're following on the Techina tradition, the tradition of the Techinot, the supplicatory prayers for women and maybe some of them were written by women, that were published from the 1500s. They're still being published today or reissued today. But these are special prayers in Yiddish for women who traditionally didn't know or weren't confident in Hebrew. And these prayers, some of which were close to the traditional Hebrew liturgy, the synagogue service, but most of the prayers, most of the techinas came out of particular moments of women's lives, out of lighting the Shabbos candles, prayers for taking the challah from the dough and casting it into the fire, prayers for observing the rituals of family purity, prayers for the childbirth bed, and so forth. And Malka, as a writer of prayers in Yiddish, and these are what these poems are, is inventing her own kind of modern, I think, Yiddish women's devotion. The first poem has no title. It was the lead poem, the prologue to her second last book, Now Is Ever, Heint is Ewig. Mein Haar, ich, dein kleiner Worten, bring dir das Gerettnis von meinen Beten, mein Vermerk, zeitig sie nicht go zeitig, als eins dein Gott. Nimm an mein Haar mit Gutwilligkeit, nur nicht mit Feier, nicht mit Feier. S'ist doch nicht emes, als du hast lieb dem Räuch von fetten Kroten. S'ist nicht emes. Wenn sehr, wie hach neulich dich es haben mir gemacht, die Jahren, als für jeden Tropfen Chesed, soll ich danken. Lord my God, I, your little garden, bring you the harvest of my soil, my bounty, ripe or not quite, all the same your boon. Accept it, my Lord, benignly, but without fire. No fire, my God. It cannot be true that you delight in the smoke of the fat offering. Not true. And see how humble the years have made me, that for each drop of mercy I am thankful. Thankful. Now, what I love about this poem is that in its humbleness, in all its humbleness, and it's the humbleness of an old person. She's really thankful, she says, for each drop of mercy that she's learned to acknowledge and to recognize over the years. But what I love about this humble, thankful, gracious poem is that it's very chutzpahdik as well. The poet wants to define God in the terms that she wants to see him. No, it can't be true that you delight in the smoke of the fat offering. You can't be the God of priestly sacrifice. You can't be the God who could allow the korban to happen. You can't be the God who could have allowed the terrible events of the 1940s to occur, which some poets have interpreted as a kind of fat offering, a smoke offering, a fire offering. And so she redefines her God as a God of peace, as a non-priestly God. And in a very strange way, this very pious poem is a poem of iconoclasm, of redefinition of God, the God that the poet wants to know and believe in. And the other poem that I want to read you is called Tata Ziser, Sweet Father. And of course, if you look at the title, Tata Ziser, it's not really Sweet Father. Sweet Father is very formal and very cold in English. Tata Ziser is Daddy dear, or my sweet daddy, but you can't really, it doesn't work. It was too cute in the English. So I went for the more elevated language in English, but the intimacy of the Yiddish is the aspect of Yiddishkeit that didn't get carried across, but maybe something did. Tata Ziser. Wenn ich ruf ihm, Tata Ziser, chwatsch ich gedenk nicht dem Taten. Doch etwas gedenkt sich. A Dorn, a Feier, a Duner, a Ball und etwas a Kohl. Wenn mir dacht sich, ich hör sein Kohl, bald schrei ich, da bin ich, Tate Ziser. Als Tate verlost, ist als noch a Tate, und ich will nicht aufhören, bänken und schreien, da bin ich, bis wird der Herren, wird sich der Monnen, und rufen mein Namen und reden zu mir durch Feier. Sweet Father. And I call him Sweet Father, although I don't remember my father, but I do remember a thorn, a fire, a thunder, a mountain, and something of a voice. When I think I hear his voice, I shout at once, here I am, sweet Father. When a father abandons, he is still a father, and I will not stop longing and calling, here I am, until he hears me, until he remembers me, and calls my name, and talks to me through fire. Now there's one other note to make about this poem. It's a very quick one. But at the end of Malka's life, she took the book that this poem had come out in front of me as I sat in the living room with her, and she took a